The Olympic marathon that became a human experiment. St. Louis, 1904. In 1904, the Olympic marathon produced two very different winners. The first man across the finish line had traveled several miles in a car, which is generally considered poor marathon technique. The official winner stayed on foot, but his assistants kept him moving with egg whites, brandy, warm baths, and 2 measured doses of strychnine. Yes, strychnine. And when he asked for water, they refused. The people running this marathon were not simply organizing a race. They were also testing some extremely confident and extremely wrong ideas about the human body. So this is the story of dust, hallucinations, roadside assistance, 1 suspicious automobile, and almost no actual marathon safety. To understand the race, forget what a modern Olympic marathon looks like. There was no perfectly standardized 26.2-mile course, no hydration table every few miles, and no medical protocol designed by people who considered consciousness a useful minimum requirement. The 1904 Games were held in St. Louis alongside the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, better known as the St. Louis World's Fair. The Olympic events were stretched across months and folded into a much larger carnival of exhibits, competitions, commercial displays, and spectacle. The Games had originally been awarded to Chicago, but St. Louis was already planning a huge sports program for the fair. Rather than compete with that machine, the Olympic movement moved the Games to St. Louis. The result was an event with loose boundaries and even looser branding. James E. Sullivan, the fair's chief of physical culture, applied the Olympic label so enthusiastically that later historians had to work out which contests were actually Olympic. There was no compact 2-week festival with a clean schedule. Sporting contests stretched across months, and some local events wore an Olympic hat because Sullivan had found the stamp and intended to use it. This matters because the marathon was not managed by the specialized Olympic system we imagine today. It sat inside a fair department whose job was to attract crowds, demonstrate physical culture, and keep the exposition looking important. The marathon was a race, a publicity event, and an opportunity for officials to test their theories. That last part matters. The Olympic marathon was still a young event. The first modern Olympic version had been run only 8 years earlier, and its exact distance was not yet standardized. The St. Louis course was about 40 kilometers, or 24.85 miles. Shorter than today did not mean kinder. The race began at 3 in the afternoon. That sentence alone should make every modern race director quietly leave the room. Charles Lucas, one of the officials, recorded a temperature of about 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, roughly 32 degrees Celsius. The runners first circled the stadium and then headed onto country roads covered in deep dust. The course included hills, rough stone, wagon traffic, and automobiles carrying officials, reporters, photographers, and support teams. Those cars repeatedly passed the athletes and lifted clouds of dust directly into the faces of men already breathing as hard as possible. Lucas blamed the dust for much of the collapse that followed. He described runners coughing, choking, and moving to the edge of the road whenever an automobile created its own private weather system. Then there was the water. Lucas wrote that there was only one official place after the stadium where runners could obtain fresh water, a well around 12 miles from the start. Felix Carvajal apparently found another drink at a water tower earlier on the course. For most of the field, however, the official plan was one water point in a hot road race lasting well over 3 hours. Modern Olympic and Smithsonian accounts describe the restriction as deliberate. Sullivan wanted to observe what limited fluid intake would do to endurance athletes. That idea did not sound as obviously reckless to every expert in 1904 as it does now. Sports medicine was not yet a mature profession with standardized rules. and endurance training was full of competing theories about water, stimulants, pacing, and the moral virtue of ignoring your organs. A confident official with a stopwatch could move surprisingly quickly from "I have a theory" to "30 men will now test it on a public road." This was not a controlled medical trial in any modern sense. There was no ethics board, no informed consent form, and no person whose job was to ask whether the marathon might benefit from less poison. But organizers did believe the conditions could produce useful scientific information. They were about to collect a great deal of data. Modern records list 32 starters from 4 countries, although Lucas wrote that 31 men answered the clerk's call. Early Olympic records are occasionally like that because even counting the runners requires a small historical investigation. Several Americans arrived with serious credentials, including recent Boston Marathon winners and the experienced Arthur Newton. These were trained distance runners, not random fair visitors who had been persuaded to run home. That makes the collapse rate more revealing. When accomplished marathon runners begin vomiting, cramping, bleeding, and abandoning a race, the simplest explanation is not that an entire generation lacked character. Then there was Tom Hicks, an English-born runner representing the United States. Hicks had finished second at Boston earlier in 1904 and was surrounded by a support team with very firm opinions. Fred Lors was another strong American runner. He would become famous for completing the first Olympic marathon with a road trip segment. Felix Carvajal of Cuba arrived in street shoes, a long-sleeved shirt and trousers cut down to resemble running shorts. Lucas says Carvajal stopped to chat with spectators, ran at a steady dog trot, and once took 2 peaches from people in a car after they refused to share. Later, retellings add rotten apples, stomach cramps, and a roadside nap. Those details are harder to confirm, so the peaches stay and the dramatic fruit coma remains on probation. 2 other runners, Len Tonyani and John Mashiani, were Tswana men from southern Africa. They were in St. Louis as part of the South African display at the World's Fair and are recognized as the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympic Games. Contemporary American accounts repeatedly mislabeled them and used racist language typical of the fair. Their participation deserves more than a quirky footnote about dogs. Tanyani finished 9th and Mashiani 12th. They completed a race that eliminated many experienced champions, even though historical records did not always preserve their names correctly. At the gun, the runners completed the opening distance inside Francis Field and streamed onto the roads. The early favorites moved toward the front, while Hicks dropped back and Lors remained in the leading group. Almost immediately, the course began removing runners. John Lorden, the previous year's Boston champion, was overcome by vomiting shortly after leaving the stadium. Others developed cramps and several runners disappeared from contention. Every passing automobile added more dust. The vehicles were supposed to supervise and document the race, but they were also actively making it worse. The people responsible for observing the runners were manufacturing one of the runners' biggest problems every time they accelerated. Historical management, apparently, sometimes means causing the emergency and taking notes. By around 9 miles, Fred Lors was suffering from cramps. He stopped running and climbed into an automobile. Normally, this is where a marathon story ends for that athlete. Lors was about to offer a more flexible interpretation of "did not finish." As the race moved deeper into the countryside, William Garcia of California collapsed near the roadside. Lucas wrote that Garcia was found roughly 8 miles from the finish with a severe stomach hemorrhage and might have died if help had arrived much later. The exact diagnosis is uncertain, but Garcia was gravely ill, removed for emergency treatment, and considered to be in danger. A runner had collapsed with serious internal bleeding. Other men were vomiting or cramping, the temperature was near 90 degrees, and race vehicles were choking the field with dust. The response was not to stop the race. The response was to continue collecting finishers. Ahead of Garcia, Meller began to struggle, and Hicks started moving forward as the leaders faded. The leaderboard was changing because the course was dismantling the field in layers. Carvajal continued at his relaxed pace in street shoes, occasionally stopping to talk. He eventually finished fourth, as though the marathon had been scheduled around his social calendar. Then Fred Lors returned. After riding for many miles, he got out of the automobile and started running again. His explanation was that the car had broken down and he wanted to return to the stadium. That is possible, although it becomes less convincing when the person continues toward the finish line. Lors was now fresh. The legitimate runners looked as if the Missouri road system had taken their participation personally. He passed competitors and headed toward Francis Field. At least one official who had seen him in the car ordered him off the course, but Lors continued. Meanwhile, Hicks was reaching the stage where running had become a negotiation between his body and two men in an automobile beside him. Those men were Hugh McGrath and Charles Lucas, the same Lucas whose report is one of our main sources. Lucas saw the events directly, but he also helped administer the treatment and later defended it. About 10 miles from the finish, Hicks began showing signs of collapse. He asked for water. Lucas says they refused. Instead, they sponged his mouth with distilled water, a distinction that apparently felt medically important at the time. Hicks continued for several miles. Then, around 7 miles from the stadium, Lucas gave him 1/60th of a grain of strychnine sulfate mixed with egg white. Strychnine was used in small doses as a stimulant in that era. It was not prohibited by Olympic anti-doping rules because Olympic anti-doping rules did not exist. Today, strychnine is recognized as a powerful poison. At toxic doses, it can cause severe muscle spasms, breathing failure, and death. So the accurate version is not that Hicks swallowed commercial rat poison from a skull-marked bottle. He received a measured medicinal dose of a substance then used as a stimulant and also capable of killing him. This was early sports medicine, where the dose makes the poison was sometimes treated as a challenge. The first dose, egg white, and continued pacing kept Hicks moving. 4 miles from the finish, he wanted to lie down, but his handlers refused because they believed he would not start again. They reduced him to a walk. Then Fred Lors ran past. For a moment, Hicks's team believed the rested man from the automobile was the leader. When they learned Lors had been disqualified, Hicks revived enough to begin a slow trot again. At the 20-mile point, his skin had turned ashen. Lucas gave him a second 1/60th grain dose of strychnine, more egg whites, and a sip of French brandy. They also bathed him with warm water kept heated on the boiler of a steam automobile. Read that list again from a modern perspective. Restricted water, 2 doses of strychnine, raw egg whites, brandy, and warm water heated on a car. And somehow the automobile still was not the most controversial form of assistance in the race. Hicks was no longer moving like a competitive runner. Lucas described him as barely lifting his legs, with heavy arms, dull eyes, gray skin, and the beginnings of hallucinations. At one point, Hicks believed the finish was still many miles away. He asked for food and asked to lie down while his team kept him upright. They made him walk uphill and jog downhill, using gravity as the final member of the support crew. The method extended the crisis instead of resolving it. This is where the story is often told as slapstick. There is poison, brandy, cars, stolen fruit, and an Olympic event apparently managed by people who had never met an athlete before. But Hicks was in genuine distress and Garcia had nearly died. The joke only works if the danger remains visible. At Francis Field, around 10,000 spectators waited for the winner. The first man they saw was Fred Lors. Lors entered the stadium looking much healthier than the men who had actually run the course. He crossed first, the crowd celebrated, and he briefly received the attention due an Olympic champion. Officials then exposed the car ride. Lors claimed he had never intended to take the honor and had crossed the line as a joke. That is his explanation, although history has generally declined to award him full credit for comedic timing. He was disqualified and initially banned from amateur competition. The punishment was later lifted. The stadium now waited for a winner who had completed the course using only his legs, 2 support automobiles, strychnine, eggs, brandy, warm water, and an impressive refusal to remain horizontal. Tom Hicks appeared at the gate. He tried to run the final lap but could manage only a stiff, exhausted shuffle. Lucas wrote that Hicks broke the tape and was then caught by an official, while other reports describe heavy support near the line. The safest conclusion is that he reached the finish in extreme distress and required immediate help. His official time was 3 hours, 28 minutes, and 53 seconds. Hicks was too weak to accept the trophy and sank into a chair. 4 doctors examined him, and Lucas reported that Hicks had lost 8 pounds, about 3.6 kilograms. 14 men were recorded as finishers, fewer than half the modern starter list. Albert Corey placed second, Arthur Newton third, and Felix Carvajal fourth. Len Tognane finished ninth, and Jan Masciani 12th. The field had included winners of major marathons, but many were beaten by heat, dust, illness, water policy, and the quality of the support available to them. Lucas argued that several runners were stronger than Hicks and might have won with better assistance. That is not a minor detail. The race did not simply identify the best endurance runner. It identified the runner whose body, handlers, stimulants, and support vehicle survived the system most effectively. Lucas believed the race showed that drugs could benefit athletes and that warm sponging was better than cold sponging. From a modern perspective, that conclusion is astonishing. The winner was hallucinating, gray, barely mobile, and unable to accept his trophy. A competitor had suffered a life-threatening collapse, and more than half the field had failed to finish. The apparent lesson was that the treatment worked because the treated athlete crossed the line. This is a classic historical trap, confusing survival with proof that the system worked. Hicks survived the methods used on him, but that did not make the method safe. Lors reached the stadium first, but that did not mean he had run the marathon. The organizers collected dramatic observations, but that did not make the race a responsible experiment. The episode also reminds us that the Olympics were not born fully formed. Standards that now feel obvious had to be developed over time. Accurate course measurement, controlled roads, hydration access, medical safeguards, and anti-doping rules all came later. The modern marathon distance of 42.95 kilometers was not standardized until 1921. Today, elite races include fluid stations, medical teams, controlled routes, and written rules. The 1904 marathon had one official well and enough automobiles to create its own environmental hazard. Fred Lors' story did not end with the car. His ban was lifted, and in 1905 he won the Boston Marathon without a documented automotive section. Tom Hicks largely stepped away from major competition after his Olympic victory. Carvajal returned to Cuba as one of the race's enduring legends. Tognane and Masciani remained historic Olympians despite decades of accounts that distorted their names and identities. Charles Lucas published a report praising the scientific value of a race in which he had personally given the winner strychnine. That may be the most 1904 detail of all. The marathon is remembered because it was absurd. But every absurdity came from something people considered reasonable. Official authority, medical confidence, national prestige, and the belief that an athlete who could still move must be fine. Hicks was not fine. He was simply still moving. And apparently that was normal. If you want another documented historical system that made perfect sense until a human body had to survive it, watch the next episode of That Was Normal.